welcome everyone to this webinar from the RCSA. Okay, so today we are here to talk to the author, Wayne Visser, of the book Thriving, a breakthrough movement to regenerative nature, society and the economy, a book that provides an innovative agenda for turning our biggest global societal challenges into opportunities to thrive. My name is Marloes Reining and I'll be your facilitator today. And we're going to kick off with thanking the sponsor as well, because we're very appreciative that they're making this webinar possible and providing you guys with the CPD validation of the webinar. So Dyck manufactures and distributes recycled rubber flooring and artificial grass for gyms, fitness zones, playgrounds, equestrian services, and more. And I'm going to show you a video because I think it's important to show you that video because the link to the documentary that we're going to be talking about, Closing the Loop. Here we go. I'm not sharing the sound because I'm going to talk to it. So this is the video that shows you how the tires are being recycled. The rubber is provided by Mathe Group, which is a recycler of truck tires in Hammersdale, KZN. They process on average 700 truck tires per day, or approximately 25 tons of rubber crumb every day. So they are able to attain 100% separation of the steel in the trucks, and then which is then sent to the foundries around the globe in South Africa, India, and South Korea. Much of this steel is then utilized in the shipbuilding and automotive industry. However, the rubber crumb that is produced is utilized in a number of industries, but more novel applications are utilized in the built environment and manufactured by Dyck. So these products include rubber flooring, high impact sports, recreational areas, acoustic underlay and cradles, and also very interesting adhesive magnetic free underlay. So it's probably the underlay of the carpets, which then doesn't use any sealants anymore to be applied to the floor. So a statement by Miran Zerabini, who is the owner of both Mathe Group and Dyck: if it can't be recycled or repurposed, it should be redesigned or removed from production. And I think that's a very nice statement in line with what we're talking about today. So today the webinar is brought to you by RCSA, Regenerative Collaborative of South Africa. We advocate for a regenerative future for all and create awareness about regenerative building and design. We'd like to do that in a collaborative way because we feel that we can do so much more together than we are alone. So if you have some free time and you want to join us as a volunteer, please join us. We have these monthly events that we're organizing, but if you're more skilled in organizing social media or other events, please let us know. We can definitely have you on board and join us. And then I'd like to announce something very exciting, which was awarded last month, is the International Living Future Institute, the ILFI, from which the RCSA is born out to. Recently announced the 2022 Living Future Heroes, and the Living Future Hero Award was created to acknowledge and celebrate individuals in the regenerative design community who have dedicated significant time and effort to advancing a living future which is socially just, culturally rich, and ecologically restorative. And our very own Thulani Kuzwayo has received this award, and Thulani is, as you know, one of the directors of the RCSA and co-founder of Paperthink Lab. He's recognized for actually building the RCSA in South Africa, and we're super happy that and super proud to have you amongst us to build the RCSA into a leading regenerative movement. So Thulani, congratulations. I know that you're in the audience. So well done, and we're super proud to have you here. Okay, let me go forward. So just to announce that our previous events can be found on our Greenet website. where you can still get CPD points for 12 months. So if you're still in need of CPD points or you're interested in the topic, obviously, then go and have a look there. And then lastly, your ideas matter. We obviously want to hear from you and get your input on your ideas and what you want this webinar to be about. So last month I did announce that you could submit your ideas, and then it was my mistake, you couldn't put in your actual email address. So I don't know. We got 7 ideas and I don't know who they are. So if you're here, please drop me a note or drop me an email, and so I can actually reward you with the 500 Rand, and I'll tell you later which ideas have made it onto the agenda for the rest of the year. Okay. So let's get started with the real topic of today. And I'm really, really excited to welcome Dr. Wayne Visser. I really struggle to start. I don't even know where to start to explain what he's done and what this, he's got a bio that's the length of a thesis itself. But Professor Dr. Visser, and I hope I can call you Wayne, is the Professor of Integrated Value and holder of the chair in Sustainable Transformation at Antwerp Management School. He's worked as a strategy analyst, sustainability advisor, CSR expert, futurist, film producer, and professional speaker. And he's been all over the world to do his work. He describes himself as a professional idea monger, storyteller, and meme weaver. And he's also called a pracademic, which really becomes obvious when you read the book, because it's not an academic book. It's a really nice, very real and practical inspiration. So I can definitely recommend reading it. He is a co-producer of 2 films, Sinking Nation and Closing the Loop, and we'll definitely share the link to the Closing Loop, which we also did on our social media. Very interesting documentary about circularity, which we'll talk about later as well. And also very interesting, he enjoys poetry, and he has also published the poetry in 6 books, and he's also going to share one of his poems at the end of the webinar. He has his roots in Zimbabwe and South Africa, and I guess therefore also there's a lot of explanations and stories about Africa in his book, and which makes it even more interesting to read for us as well. So it's not just an international book. So welcome, Wayne. Thank you for joining us here and talking about your book.
Thanks for having me.
Very exciting to have this conversation.
Yeah, great to be here.
Thank you.
Hello, audience. Hi.
So personally, I really enjoyed reading the book. I tend to be quite pessimistic about where the world is going and looking at the news and the lack of progress. And especially also in the green building industry, I sometimes think there is not enough progress. But your book has an incredible positive lens, and it really speaks of hope and includes many examples of the good things that are happening. So it definitely made me see things in a lot more positive way. And I'm going to start off with the first question, and I guess a lot of your interviews start with this, because the book starts off with this story about your near-death experience in Sotwana Bay, and talking about the signs that were warning you, but you're not really paying attention to it. Would you like to tell us a little bit about that in your own words?
Sure. Well, I don't know how many of you have been to Sotwana Bay. It's a beautiful beach, and I had a holiday there with my wife and my parents a few years ago. And indeed, when you arrive at the beach, there's a sign, a danger sign, and on the sign is a picture of a shark, of a crocodile, and of a hippopotamus. But, you know, I mean, we're from Africa. This is not something to panic about. It just means, you know, keep your eyes peeled. And so we went for a nice swim in the beach. It was quite rough. The waves were big. The sign that we didn't pay any attention to was a different one on the beach. And that was the sign for danger, beware of riptides. And in fact, my wife and I got swept out to sea, and we had a few moments where we really thought we would drown. And we were lucky we didn't, of course. But I use this as a metaphor, really, to say, firstly, often the risks that we are tackling in society are the most obvious ones. They're the ones that are in our face, that are urgent, that are, the crisis of now. And the ones that will probably kill us if we don't pay attention to them are the slower, more invisible risks like that riptide, that undercurrent. And these can be things like growing inequality or climate change, or indeed the catastrophic biodiversity loss. We don't see this every day, and it's not that obvious, but these are the things which could cause the whole system to collapse. The second lesson I took from that was just that probably what would have killed us was not the tide itself. I mean, we're both good swimmers. We've grown up swimming in the ocean and elsewhere. It was that we panicked. And I think this is another lesson for us in society. We're in the midst of numerous crises right now, and the natural thing to do is to panic, but it's the panic that causes us to behave in less than wise ways. And we need to just calm down, see the bigger picture, see the direction of travel, and take the next best step.
Mm. But then somewhere else in the book, you also had an example of where we're not panicking enough. And I think you mentioned the example of like a fire alarm in the gym where the fire alarm goes off and actually nobody is doing anything, whereas like everybody's sort of looking and feeling out what's going to happen, and do we really have to start moving or start acting.
I mean, that's a slightly different point. Even when a fire alarm goes off, we shouldn't panic, right? we should assess the danger and act. And that was really the point I was making in that part, was that even when the alarms go off, we're very bad at taking action, the right kinds of action and dramatic enough action. And we can apply that to many of the issues we face today. So it is important that also when I say that, I'm hopeful or that I'm optimistic, this is not a blind hope, and it's not an uninformed optimism. It's not denial. Actually, what it is facing up to the challenges square on. I quote as well in the book something called the Stockdale paradox, which was named after Admiral Stockdale, who was an American Navy officer who survived for 7 years in a prisoner of war camp in Vietnam. And what he said was, in order to survive, you have to confront the brutal facts of your reality. There can be no fooling yourself, but you can never lose hope that it's possible that things can change and get better. And that's a paradox.
Absolutely. I'd like to start with the title of the book, "Thriving," and it's like how I perceived it reading the book was like it's sort of the new next sustainability kind of word that we should be using. I know that you have an interesting opinion about the word sustainability, and I'd like you to say something about why thriving is such a much better word, and what do you mean by thriving?
Yeah, happy to do that. Yeah, if you think about it, sustainability. Now, I've been working in sustainability for all my career, more than 30 years now, way back to when I was a student at University of Cape Town, and that was before the Rio Earth Summit. It was just the year after sustainable development was defined by the United Nations in 1987. And it was a very clever political concept, the idea that we can develop in the global south, while the global north really doesn't have to give up anything. It just has to ensure it's not imposing too much of a burden on the future generations. And what I see after more than 30 years is, firstly, that still it's not clear. If I ask everyone in this room to say what sustainability is, I'll probably get a lot of different answers. And this is despite the fact that we've got definitions, we've got 17 Sustainable Development Goals. It gets interpreted and misused and abused in lots of different ways. Secondly, it's not effective. I mean, you only have to look at the trends to realize that many of them are still headed in the wrong direction after more than 30 years of effort. And by the way, business doing way, way more than ever it did before. Yet still, we're not solving the problem through this effort of sustainability or sustainable development. And the third and maybe most important thing is that it's boring. I mean, it's really not inspiring. If you say to somebody, let's say you wake up and you turn to your partner and you say, I'd really like for our relationship to be sustainable. I'm not sure you're going to get too many kisses. It's dead boring. It's like saying you want to survive or you want to breathe. Well, of course you do. But that's not the reason for living. And that's not our reason for being either in society or in companies or in the economy. So the main point here is that we're actually aiming too low. And as a result of aiming too low, we're underachieving as well. It really matters that we are ambitious, that at least what we're striving for is what otherwise is called net positive or regeneration or thriving. Thriving, of course, is much clearer. If I say to you, what does it mean to thrive? I think I'll get similar answers because we understand what that means. And most importantly, it is about leaving a world behind that is better for us having existed, whether we're individuals or companies, than if we didn't exist at all. And at the moment, most of us and almost every company can't say that. And the reason is because we haven't even been aiming for that. We've been aiming to do a little bit less damage while we carry on with our activities.
Yeah, and I think, and that's really in synchronization with what we're doing as the RCSA, where we talk about living buildings, or I guess that you can call them thriving buildings then as well, where you design buildings that have a positive impact as opposed to doing less bad.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, whether it's the well building certification or the living building challenge, or the way that you frame it, we can do this. We can actually design things to be positive, to be energy positive, to be water positive, to make us more healthy than if we hadn't existed in that building. But we have to design for that.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so the book is structured around 6 forces or 6 forces of breakthrough, which are sort of the response to the 6 forces of breakdown. What I found interesting reading the book is that, like, even though it's a generic, like it touches on a lot of different type of industries in the world, what I find that each of these are applicable to the built environment that we are working in, and from each of these, so the book for the listeners, the book is basically structured according to these 6 main forces of breakthrough, and maybe you can explain a little bit, like how do we read this thing? So these are the forces of breakdown, and then
breakdown. For each force of breakdown, and there are 2 in nature, 2 in society, and 2 in the economy, there is a counter force of breakthrough. And the final column there is the market opportunity, or how it manifests through the market in each case. And by the way, I reached this by doing a bit of backcasting about 10 years ago, having got frustrated by all the debates that still go on about, what is sustainability and what are we really trying to do. I said, well, surely there are some things we could agree, like the type of future that we want. And when you do that, you discover that it's not that hard to come up with a description of what a better society would look like. And you want a society where, you know, ecosystems are flourishing, where resources are being renewed, where people are treated fairly, and there's not a lot of inequality, where people are healthy, and where technology is used to connect us and empower us rather than you know, divide us and increase our negative impacts, and where we're able to cope with crises, where we have some kind of security and safety. And that was the basis of the model, which I refined over the last 10 years. I think it's useful as a way to check many things. So you could, as you say, check this for designing a building. You could check it for you know, coming up with a new product, or you could check it for a whole organization or a society or a city. And the question is just to what extent, you know, are you advancing the breakthroughs versus adding to the breakdowns? But you have to be really honest with yourself. I mean, this is not a PR exercise. Because if we look at the first two, there are very few examples of companies or projects that genuinely go about bringing their solutions without trading off the nature piece. And that's what's getting us into trouble, because we can only do that for so long and then it all falls apart.
Yeah. And it's also interesting from our point, like from the building, we trying to mitigate the first two, but we often forget to look at the other, like responsibility, revitalization, which is around well-being. And I think those are also actually quite interesting topics to start integrating into designing building in the built environment.
Yeah. And in fact, at Antwerp Management School, where I have my chair, we created another chair in real estate, but the person that we appointed there came at it from a social point of view, and they were really interested in what are the behaviors that we are incentivizing or encouraging through the design of the building. So buildings can encourage you to act unsustainably and irresponsibly, or the opposite. And it's a very interesting perspective, because we always think of buildings as being more on the physical side and to do with environmental impacts. But, you know, it really matters how you do it and whether people have the right space to act responsibly.
Yeah. If we go in a little bit into more like the circular economy, and also chatting a little bit about the documentary that you've made, which came out, I think it was in 2018.
Yeah.
And it also the sponsor of today was also featured in the documentary, so that was a nice circular coming back to all the same thing. And there's also, I think that it's particularly interesting because the application in the building industry, because there are so many things that we can look at from a circular point of view, like different building materials are made of waste from another industry. Or like one thing that I found in the book was the biomason, which was a brick that grows itself, which I had not heard of before, which is an innovation. And I've seen that company has grown quite a lot, living concrete and sponsored these.
Yeah, that actually is one of the most exciting things. But to take a step back, I would say the construction building industry is starting to take this seriously, and there's lots of different ways we can do it. One is simply to look at the materials themselves. So are we bringing recycled materials into construction? And you do get some companies that are starting to do that. We can reuse a lot of, you know, of the materials when we go into construction. So, you know, an example of a company that's doing that is Stone Cycling. They create materials that are made 100% from previous building materials. And then, of course, you've got to look at all of the materials themselves. The living concrete is really a breakthrough area, because you'll be aware that the construction industry has quite a big carbon footprint, and one of the biggest reasons, beside actually heating and cooling our buildings, is the production of cement, of concrete, of bricks, which take place at a high temperature. And to get that high temperature, we need fossil fuels to heat. So having a technique that effectively uses bacteria to grow these materials and does it at ambient temperatures, this is revolutionary, because this is how nature does it. Nature doesn't do very much at high heat, except for volcanoes. For the rest, it designs at ambient temperature. And so I think that's really exciting. And there are many other areas. So there are we call it biofabrication. So there are bio-based materials as well, fabrics, which can also be used in construction. There is the use of algae, especially. There's a company called Dyck, which has, they're best known at the moment in the textiles industry for footwear. So they have a brand called Bloom, which is the foam in your trainers. But again, they've made this entirely from algae, and that grows fast. It absorbs carbon while it grows. It's totally bio-based and can biodegrade. So that's how we have to be thinking. A lot of what we use in buildings is color, of course, in our paints and dyes and so on. And the dyeing industry, I wish it was a dyeing industry, but it's the second biggest polluter in the world, the chemical dyes that we use to create color. So you've got an example like colorifics, which again just uses, in this case, the genes that create color in nature, inserts those into bacteria, and so they effectively grow dyes, which are completely bio-based again and non-toxic. So that's a Cambridge startup. So we have a lot of these solutions in terms of materials, I would say. The energy part, I think you'll all be very familiar with. I mean, we have to go to renewables, we have to go to passive buildings. I mean, there's so much we can do there, ground heat pumps and other elegant solutions. And same on the water. I mean, water has to be 100% recycled, and we know how to do those things. The other thing, though, is to think about the whether you have to own everything, right? So this is more the idea of the sharing economy or the lease economy. I take the example of our campus in Antwerp. It's a fairly new building, maybe it's 5 years old now. So we had the opportunity to mostly build it from new, although we were taking part of an old building, so we had to keep some of the cultural facade. But what we did is we entered a circular economy contract for our lights, for our audiovisual equipment, for our furniture. And what this means is we don't own any of those things. The companies that are doing all of that for us have to look after, maintain, replace, recycle, upgrade, all of those things. And, that means it's in their best interest also to make it as sustainable as possible. And, to provide those things for us as a service. And I think that's a big part of the solution as well.
Yeah, some of those ideas we were actually discussing in our office as well. Yeah, heating and cooling as a service, as opposed to, an installation and an asset to a building.
Yeah, the other one I didn't mention, but I think it's also well known to, is just biophilic design, right? So just designing with as much nature as possible, and that has, of course, benefits for the climate because you're absorbing carbon. So green roofs, green walls. I visited, for example, the tallest green wall in the world, which is in Singapore. It's an apartment building. I can't remember how many stories high, and it's beautiful, and a cool building. So they have less need for air conditioning. But besides this, of course, there are mental well-being and physical well-being benefits. We know that exposure to any kind of nature, indoors and outdoors, reduces our stress levels, and so we're less likely to suffer from those effects. So there's a lot we can do on green roofs and green walls. In London, if you take the green roofs that exist, the biodiversity on those green roofs is higher than in the surrounding countryside. Now, partly that's indictment on the kind of agriculture we have and we practice, which is industrial, chemical based. But it also suggests that by designing properly, you can really attract biodiversity and give it a refuge.
This also reminds me of one of the examples you gave in your book about the mini forest in the Japan mini forest, where they had like small areas forested and that had more biodiversity than the surrounding
pocket forest, which I love.
Pocket forest,
and it's literally it can be very small spaces, 10 meters or even less, but they plant them very densely with lots of different tree species, and these become little havens where again the biodiversity is much higher than the surrounding countryside or the city, of course.
And if you would think of like a thriving city, what would that sort of look like?
Yeah, that's a much bigger question. It's very interesting. I would do this exercise actually with my MBA students in South Africa. And if I remember, actually, Thulani gave some guest talks to that class as well at Gibbs, Gordon Institute for Business Science. And what I would ask them to do is exactly that, to define what would be a thriving city using KPIs, using indicators. And I would show them all the different indexes we have of livable cities and prosperous cities and so on that exist out there, and there are a lot, and they rank cities of the world, and South African cities don't score very well. Then it's a case of picking which elements are most important to you. So it's very subjective, but of course, green space is often seen as absolutely essential. And so how much green space have you got, and how accessible is it? Is it green space for the rich? Because actually, I heard the mayor of Los Angeles talk about this, that shade is a justice issue, a social justice issue, because those with the least shade are the poorest. And yet those are the ones who need it the most. So when we do greening of cities, we should be targeting the poorest or the most deprived areas first. Of course, it typically doesn't happen. If I'm thinking of Sandton, it's not the most deprived area of Johannesburg. So that's one thing, right? So the greening, and linked to that, I must just mention another concept which you might have come across, which is sponge cities. So more and more we will be affected by floods because of climate change. And so again, mostly pioneered in Asia, but just planting with lots of wetlands, lakes, and areas of the city that can absorb flash floods is a very smart thing to do. You can minimize the damage. But then there are all the other things around access to transport, whether you've got the option for public transport, how clean is that transport, whether there is a justice element to that. That's obviously very important as well. In fact, you could go through again those 6 transitions and say, on each of those, how does my city fare?
And for the audience, please note that you are more than welcome to submit any questions for Wayne. So use the chat or raise your hand. The sponge city, by the way, is a quiz question, so I hope you've listened well. So if we talk a little bit about the transportation, you mentioned an example in your book. I think it was around the convergence and the process that sort of causes complex living system to sometimes change very rapidly. And the example was around I think it was New York, where it went from carriages to cars. How would that look now for our future? Would it be like from cars back to pedestrianization, or do you think electrification would be what is and especially in South Africa, obviously, we're so car-centric here. What would like sort of, I mean, Europe is still built around a lot of pedestrianization, so it's easier to go maybe back to that. But for a South African city, it's a completely different story.
Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, I think what it has to be, what the convergence would be, there's definitely a convergence happening around energy. So we can and we will get to cities that are powered renewably. Now, I know that might sound like something far-fetched when you're in South Africa and you've got load shedding and you're still very dependent on coal and so on. But this really is a trend that's sweeping the globe to the extent that it's just not going to make any economic sense. I mean, your politicians are not going to be able to justify why they keep investing in coal, oil, and gas, because the prices, not even just now with the crazy Russia war, but solar and wind are the cheapest form of electricity in almost every country today already, and the prices continue to drop. They've dropped more than 90% in the last 10 years. And linked to this is batteries. So battery storage, not only for homes, which is important as well, linked to solar or wind, but for grid level battery storage, so that we don't have the intermittency that is always worried about. So I think although this may feel and sound like a sort of a rich Western Northern agenda, it will become the standard. I was just looking at some graphs just before I came on this call, and China has just overtaken Europe and America in terms of the most installed solar capacity in renewables. This is not just a solution for the rich anymore. This is actually the most accessible solution now on energy. So there's a whole thing that has to happen there around energy. Linked to that will be electric cars. Now, again, that may be a few more years off in a South African context, but don't underestimate it, because in the same way that the International Energy Agency consistently underestimated how fast renewables is spreading, renewables today reached 13% globally, growing extremely, extremely fast. They've also been underestimating how quickly electric vehicles are being adopted. And now with the energy crisis with Russia, that's just even more of a force that causes convergence. So I'm talking about this to try to illustrate convergence. Convergence is when you get these forces that reinforce one another. So think about what's happening here. You've got technology giving us a solution and the price going down rapidly and becoming actually price competitive, to the extent that in a few years, actually, to run a fossil fuel power plant will be more expensive than to install a new wind or solar plant. So you've got that force. Then you've got, all of the social movements going on, whether it's the climate strike movement or just the social unrest about access to energy. You've got your own, needs in South Africa. You just want reliable energy, for a start, and sufficient energy and energy that you can scale. Well, the problem with, big fossil fuel plants is they take a long time to build. They're, in renewables, you can actually scale extremely, extremely fast. So you have the social pressure, which is converging on that technology breakthrough. And then you have the market opportunity, because if you do it right, this is where the growth is, and therefore this is where companies will make the profits. Now, Tesla's been the front runner, let's say, on electric vehicles. They've been the most shorted stock, because everybody thought they must fail, until they became the $6 trillion company, making less than 1% of the world's cars. So, valued at higher than all the other automakers, which are now rapidly trying to catch up. But what effect that has had is now electric vehicles start to become very cheap. So we start to get lots of models, literally hundreds of models coming onto the market at that lower price point. So it's not that everybody in South Africa is going to suddenly buy a Tesla, but you're going to get the Chinese and especially the Koreans with very low cost models that actually are very high performance. So, you know, you've got that reinforcing effect. And then you do have policy, which has a reinforcing effect. Now, your policy may be, let's say, weak or not as well enforced, or you've got state capture in South Africa, but it's still something that is an incentive in the right direction, because South Africa has also signed up to the Paris Climate Agreement and is also striving for that. And then you've got climate change itself, which is having all of these, you know, catastrophic impacts, floods, droughts, and so on. You know, and so what's happening is all of these are reinforcing one another, so that the switch to that more renewable, let's call it regenerative city and transport network, as we've been talking about, an energy network, will be much faster than people think, even in developing contexts like South Africa. So if you're thinking it's going to take 50 years, it'll probably take 10 years.
Yeah, I mean, we do see the changes happening here, especially on the renewable side, a lot more. But let's give Mabuto an opportunity to ask his question.
Thank you for having me. I hope it's appropriate to call you Dr. Wayne Visser. Is that appropriate?
Just Wayne is good, thanks.
Okay, Wayne. I would like to say thank you for this opportunity you've provided, and I can quite resonate with most of the stuff that you just mentioned. I am a trained and a qualified horticulturist who is in the path for entrepreneurship. I just started my own company, which is Bio Landscapes. So obviously bio represents all the biophilic concepts that we really need most. But quite frankly, as we're talking about sustainable development, it really seems a very fancy sounding name. And the most where it's needed, people actually don't have any idea. And for that, about a month ago, I went to Transkei, former Transkei rather, Eastern Cape in East London. I was more focused in teaching people about how to rehabilitate wetlands. And it went well. It's just that I could see that I need resources, because I'm still a small enterprise company that is trying to assist. And I can see that people need more of action taken for awareness of rehabilitation of wetlands. And I would hope maybe you have a platform of mentoring young entrepreneurs who are very enthusiastic about the environment, because money will always be an issue, but in my most concern is the knowledge behind it. We need to make sure it becomes more and more transparent where it's needed most.
Yeah, it's a great point that firstly also that sustainability sometimes gets in the way. You know, it's a jargon word, you know, people don't know what it means. And that's another reason just to talk about thriving or regeneration, or just, you know, something that just talk the language that people can understand. Now, I would say that the area you're working in is so vital, and yet is neglected, hugely neglected by governments and by business. We still struggle to show companies especially what their link is to ecosystems and biodiversity loss. So we have a huge challenge here. You know, one of the most ripe areas, of course, is the move to regenerative agriculture. And that is starting to happen, and some of the big players are really getting behind it, but there's a long way to go. And then if you take it down to the level of, you know, designing, you know, landscape sort of design, then incorporating things like wetlands and other things will really bring a solution to the biodiversity issues. But we have to get much better at articulating the business case for that. And so far, that's a harder sell than the climate issues. So you can always use the climate issue, of course. And we're starting to see now the UN have convening around trying to get similar global goals as the Paris Climate Agreement, but for biodiversity. And that's going to help, I think, but it is harder. You have to talk about the the benefits to health and well-being, and what it can cost people if they don't have that health or well-being, the damage that you might see from climate change if you don't have design in a certain way, even the damage to the food system if we lose our pollinators and so on. So it's a more nuanced discussion, and I agree with you, it's harder and we still need a lot of education there. Since you are a young entrepreneur, though, I do think that, a lot of the bigger companies are claiming to support sustainability. They may not be using the language of thriving yet, but I think that they're the ones who should be partnering with the entrepreneurs, supporting them in their supply chains especially, and giving them the resources that they need, the education platforms that they need. So yeah, I think you're in the right spot, but it's not an easy spot. It's one that we need. And the good thing is that there is a growing, I would say, group of entrepreneurs working in this space. If you look at the Natural Capital Protocol and the Capitals Coalition, this is one sort of hub where you might find others. It's a moving space, but it's an exciting one.
Yeah, and there's quite a number of opportunities for young entrepreneurs to enter competitions in South Africa. And even at GIPS, there was a green entrepreneur session as well. If you drop me an email afterwards, then I can also direct you into some interesting spaces.
I just want to answer also Tali's question or suggestion about electric cars. So the answer is electric cars are better even if it's fueled by a dirty grid. If you look across the life cycle of cars, including the emissions during production and during the use of the car, even on a dirty grid, electric vehicles are better. They are not without problems. We have to think about what to do with the batteries. We have to think about where the metals come from and so on. But these are manageable issues. And especially on the recycling, we're already setting up that circular economy for the batteries. They're very valuable, those batteries. And even on the metals, we're already looking at alternatives. Battery technology is very early in its development. So we may not stick with lithium-ion batteries. There may be other superior ones, and they're designing them in ways to reduce the dependence on the rare metals. But the point is also that despite it already being better to have an electric vehicle, the grid will get cleaner all the time. And so I know it's used as a reason to maybe delay, but I think it's a false reason that we do need to go straight to electric as soon as we can. But I do also want to say that electric is not the answer to everything. Shared mobility is really important. Autonomous vehicles, I think, will come also sooner than people think. So effectively, Uber or Tesla robo-taxis, I think, will exist, and just improving public transport, I think, is in a country like South Africa is probably still a bigger priority than getting everybody to have an electric vehicle. Electric vehicles don't solve our congestion problem either, especially if everyone's owning their own. So just continuous investment, and we get more options. We get the electric scooters now, we get electric bikes, which really have taken over, which give us more options in the concentrated areas of the city. But beyond that, it's got to be continuous investment in the buses, in the trains, the things that we know. Do you want me to answer also on leadership? I see another one came in.
Yeah, it was actually one of the questions that I'm going to have now as well. Like you talk about finding your inner superhero, and is there some kind of special superpower we need to have to become a thriving leader?
Yeah. So in the book, I present two main views on this. The one is based on research I did for my PhD, which was what is it that really motivates us at a deep level to be involved in anything to do with sustainability. So I used existential psychology to analyze, and it turns out that we have this deep need to make a difference, and we share that. But beyond that, we are very different in how we can be most effective as change agents, as leaders. And it's really important to know which type of purpose-inspired leader you are. And so coming out of my research, I identified 4 types. The first is an expert type. So this is somebody who really just loves the detail, loves the knowledge element, loves designing systems, and it's very project and task focused. And that's what motivates them, and that's great. We need those people. But then you get a facilitator who's all about, loving to work in teams, loving to, empower others through training or coaching, and it's all about the people. That's different again from the catalyst, who really is interested in the politics of change, by which I mean not necessarily party politics, but just how do you change an organization or a society by influence. So how do you change the minds of your managing directors or your sales people? And so it's very much an organizational level focus. You're interested in changing the strategy and the direction of an organization. And then the last is the activist, who's very much motivated by the grassroots issues and acting at a grassroots level as an activist would, and asking the difficult questions and really rocking the boat. And they struggle to survive, especially in large organizations. They often become entrepreneurs or small companies or NGOs or academics. So, so it helps to know which one you gravitate towards. We all actually usually put on all 4 of those hats, even sometimes in one day. We have to play those different roles. But where is it that you get your energy from? And where is it that you feel you have to put in a lot of energy to get very little return? If you can find your sweet spot, align that to your role or your job, then you're likely to be a more effective change agent. And then that's the one look at it. The others, I've done research with Cambridge and with Antwerp Management School around what are the characteristics of leaders that we need to create a thriving future. And, I identify 6 characteristics, and I don't know if I'll get them now all offhand, but, it's definitely things around systems thinking. It's around having courage. So courageous leaders, that's often moral courage. There's a creativity element. So we want leaders that are really innovative. We need leaders who are inclusive, that really listen and are often quiet leaders. You may not even know who they are. They're not on the pedestal. So they achieve by empowering others. You definitely need strategic leaders in the sense that they're willing to see and plan for the long term and not just do the short-term returns to shareholders. So all of these mixture of characteristics are what we need right now.
I guess there's no one thing fits all. I think we all have something to contribute in whatever form we bring that change. There's a question from Jennifer. You mentioned that nature creates at ambient temperature. In a fast-paced world where time is money, especially in business and city building development, do we need more of a mindset change to enable thriving, regenerative nature in business, cities, products, and manufacturing?
Yeah, well, I do think we need a mindset change. And one of the things is we have to realize how nature designs. Somebody mentioned in the chat biomimicry earlier, which is a great sort of source.
Which we're going to have a webinar on in 2 months' time, by the way. So that's great.
But one of the things that nature does is it has its own pace, and it also has quite a lot of slack in the system. There is built-in redundancy. And if we look at the way that we live today and the way that we work and the way that we build and construct, you know, everything is, as you say, fast-paced with no margin for error, you know. And so when there is a crisis or a disruption, everything gets stuck because there's no slack in the system. And so this is really hard to do, but it is vitally important. We have to, as individuals, have slack in our own systems. That means downtime for recovery, rest, rejuvenation. It means having a backup. You know, what happens if we're out of action, as many of us have been for COVID, for example? What's the backup in our family? What's the backup in our workplace? And then, you know, in construction or simply in supply chains, we have to have that spare capacity. And the problem is it seems to business like inefficiency, but in the bigger scheme of things, it's far more effective because it allows for adjustment, for flexibility, and for, you know, for resilience in the end when we're disrupted, as we constantly will be. And I think as well, the whole area of mindfulness starts to come in here, where, you know, this is a technique, whether you do that by simply walking in or connecting with nature, or you actually do meditation or something else. This is part of the sort of, you know, regeneration that we need at the individual level to allow us to take a more balanced view on our work and on our projects and so on.
Nice. Milan has a question. Do you have any concepts or how we can personally start thriving in our day-to-day lives? I know that you're a vegan, so am I. So that's always a good one to start with.
Yeah, well, I touched on one, which is, you know, how do you make sure that you are thriving in your health and well-being? So really taking the time to, whatever the practice is, to be healthy. And that obviously has to do with exercise. You know, I reluctantly do some exercise in terms of swimming at the gym or cycling, things like that. But my joy is from walking, so I walk a lot, and actually that is part of it. Or connecting with nature. I think these are personal things we can do to make sure that we thrive, that we have the energy to, you know, make our impact in the world. But then, you know, taking a slightly bigger picture, there are really, you know, 4 or 5 things where you can make absolutely key decisions. So let's start with one that you mentioned, is what we eat. Now, you know, there's just no getting around the fact that high consumption of meat is at the heart of a lot of our problems globally right now. It's very strongly linked to climate change, to biodiversity loss, and all kinds of impacts we don't want, to heart disease. So by moving to more plant-based diets, we could cut premature mortality by 20%. So there's a health element there. But then the impacts on land, on water, and on energy, you know, there are different figures for those, but on the whole, let's say if you eat a Beyond Burger, a plant-based burger, or an Impossible Burger, these are very good now. I mean, they really taste great. You will cut your impact immediately by more than 80%. So, you know, these are small choices we can make just to go more plant-based. And there's a hierarchy, right? So red meat is the highest impact, obviously, you know, and then you go down the hierarchy, you know, pork and lamb, then chicken, fish, and so it goes down. So diet is one thing. And by the way, it's a really exciting area of cultivated meat that is just at its infancy, but will revolutionize the food industry, because that is growing meat from cells So you will still be able to eat your meat that bleeds. It'll be exactly the same meat that you want to eat if you want to eat meat, but it'll be grown in a vat and will again have 80% less impact. So food is the one. Then, of course, transport is the other. How do you get around? So, you know, if you don't have the electric vehicle, you know, are you using public transport as much as possible? Are you minimizing flight as much as possible? Are you offsetting if you do fly? It's not the solution, but it helps. And so these are questions around how you move, how you get around. Then there's a question around what do you buy? And here we can always choose to buy organic. This makes a difference. It's unfortunately usually more expensive, but buy organic, buy fair trade. You know, these really do make a difference in the lives of those in the supply chain, especially the farmers and the producers. And then your energy source is the other place you can really make an impact. So choose for renewable energy if you can. More and more you have that option. So either, you know, if you can install it on your own, get a little bit grid independent, or find a supplier where they offer that so that you can boost the demand. And then the last one is where you work, you know, and what type of work you do. So are you working for or indeed running a purpose-driven business? Or are you working for a company that's really part of the problem and is dragging its heels and is sort of a legacy business? You can sometimes change those from within, but that's pretty tough. So it's really about the kind of work you do and whether you're actively supporting the revolution through the work. So those are some things that we can all do in our life. Of course, if you have the luxury of having a garden, you know, you can already boost biodiversity simply by gardening in a different way and planting native trees and wildflowers and so on.
Yeah, that's a very nice summary of the action that we can take as like in your individual capacity. I know that we're running towards the end, but I want to ask this question around what do you feel is the role of government in this movement towards a more regenerative future? And you know, I'm asking this because especially in South Africa, you know, a lot of people are, you know, struggling to put food on the table, and climate change is definitely not the first thing on their minds. And I'm wondering how, and then in the end, it will be the poor that are hit hardest when it comes to the effects of climate change. And do you have any ideas or like how, you know, the developed world and the developing world can sort of work together, or how they're going to be reliant or dependent on each other to create this, so that it's not just the developed world that's going to thrive, and you know, and the developing world is just running behind everything again.
Yeah. Well, there is the element of finance that comes in here, and I'm encouraged to see that in the COPs, in the Conference of Parties, this has really been escalated now, that the developed countries do need to be financing you know, the adaptation in developing countries, and they've fallen short on that. We know that, but the pressure is mounting and is mounting. And for the first time at COP26 in Glasgow, also the notion of paying for damages has come up, and I think that's not going to go away. That'll probably be even stronger at COP27. So we have to keep the pressure up for that, but that's a government-led initiative from international governments, and some money will flow, but it's like pulling teeth, to be honest. So we have to be more creative as well, and this is where I think that collaboration between companies, also NGOs can play a role as well, but sharing of technology, licensing of technology, making sure that when developing countries develop, that they develop along a clean path. And what that means is that the responsibility in some ways is on those developed countries to ensure that the technology scales sufficiently and is designed in a way that it's not expensive. So frugal innovation becomes absolutely key. How do you design something to be affordable and sustainable? And then how do you share that technology with developing countries? So we do start to see it on some issues like renewables. We see from COP26, what was it, 8 million, I can't remember, going to South Africa to help with the transition to renewables. So that was one of the things coming out. So that's one of the things. And there is actually the Glasgow Breakthrough Agenda, which was all about innovation, and there were 5 areas of breakthrough, one of which was around clean technology, specifically making it more accessible. How do we ensure that this technology gets into the hands of those who most need it, who are typically in developing countries? So I do think a lot of that's going to happen. But then the last thing is, we shouldn't underestimate how much innovation is happening in developing countries, frugal innovation, because the necessity is there. People in Europe don't even know what load shedding is, right? So they're not going to invent something that is going to address needs that you have like this. So the entrepreneurship is there, I think, in developing countries, and just finding ways to support that in every way that we can, to share among developing countries also, and increasingly even to sell that back to the developed countries, because I think that, they have a different way of innovating. It's very structured. It's very, big investments in big projects, whereas the bottom-up innovation is where you find real social entrepreneurship and eco-entrepreneurship in developing countries. I see just 1 or 2 more questions. There was a follow-up question from Andrew on electric, swapping cars, basically. Like I said, I don't think electric is the solution to everything. I think it will be part of the solution because people do still want individual mobility and convenience. But more and more, if we can have versions of public transport, whether that's, autonomous electric buses or others, I think that's going to be a big part of it. And then, reducing the need to travel as well is the other thing which we start to see with technology. I don't quite know, Thulani, what you mean by essentialism in green building. So maybe you want to just clarify that, and then I'll try and answer that as the last question.
Thanks, Wayne. I was just basically borrowing a term in that we're saying sometimes in this green building movement is that you only have to have all these characteristics, therefore you are then green. So in this Architects Declare, they had stated this: for climate change, for instance, this is what we stand for. If one of those things you don't fit in, then you can't be part of us. And sometimes there are practices, and I see there's some architectural practices in this room where they don't get involved because they feel it either limits the way they work, even though they believe that the work they are doing and producing does speak to regeneration, as an example. Yeah. Have you seen this kind of pattern where there's resistance to being put into a corner and being forced to perform and behave in a certain way, or are they taking a step back and looking at the bigger picture?
Yeah, I think we see this happening a lot, and not just in the building industry. So often it's linked to certification. So I was just, for my podcast, Thriving Podcast, I was just interviewing someone from Radis Cotton. So they're building the first regenerative organic cotton value chain in the world. They work with growers in India. And there is a certification, fairly new certification, for regenerative organic textiles. And what they do is they follow all of the guidance from that certification, but they don't go for the certification because that makes it prohibitive just from a cost point of view, and it becomes a little elite club. And that's unfortunate. That happens often with certification, but even sometimes just with people self-declaring this is what it means to be thriving or sustainable. And if you don't make this grade, then you don't qualify. So I think we have to have a much more open and adaptive and flexible approach. It's always with thriving, it's about, are you moving in the right direction? And are you, moving as quickly as possible? And if you are, then I think you should be welcomed into the movement and then learn from others, get better and better, not worry too much about whether you have the official stamps or certifications. Of course, we don't want greenwashing. We don't want people just self-declaring that they're, brilliant when they aren't. But I think following the right principles and just having a coalition of the willing and the early movers, I think that's very valuable. And we should reduce the barriers as much as possible. Don't let perfect become the enemy of progress.
Great. I think we've come to the end of our conversation. Time is definitely flying, and I think there's a lot more to chat about. You mentioned you have a podcast where people can find you.
Yes, and I see the link was shared. Thank you for that.
Yeah,
so welcome all to please listen to the podcast, but also send me suggestions of who you think should be featured in the podcast. I've just finished recording with Kumi Naidu, who you may or may not know, but a great South African who was executive director of Greenpeace, as well as being in the leadership of Amnesty International, and now runs as chairman of Africans Rising. So that's the kind of person that we're featuring, and I'd like to feature more of. We're going to have, since it's in your area, something specifically around what thriving means for the building industry. We'll have a guest, one of my Cambridge colleagues, Munish Datta, who was running the Green Building Council for the UK for a number of years. So we'll be having him on. But we have a wide variety, and I encourage you to tune in, but also give suggestions of who else's voice should be heard on that podcast.
Great. Okay, then I think we can close off, and I'm going to ask you to read out a poem for us.
Yes.
And I was lucky enough to choose it, so I chose Change the World. Yeah.
Yes, I'm happy to do that. And just before I do, because I'll close with that, on the book, just to say, for those who haven't been spending your nights reading it, just to say you have the option, right? There's a paper version, but there's also an ebook version and an audiobook version. So depending on how you like to consume your content, you can look out for all of those. And there are also summary articles that I've been publishing. But indeed, I integrate poetry through this, and I think that's also important about what it means to thrive. Means bringing our whole person and engaging with people at all levels. So we can't only engage people at the head level and make this all about a rational argument. We have to engage their hearts, their emotions, their hands, of course, and also their spirits. And I do just find it's my way to do this, but I find poetry is one of the ways, and I impose this on many strange audiences, including top executives. They get a surprise when I do a keynote, and then suddenly it ends with a poem. And also my Cambridge students, who are often, they're people, mid-career professionals doing business sustainability management, and I just find that people don't think they will enjoy it, and they enjoy it because it's not Shakespeare, right? It's words and reflections about what's going on in the world right now. So let me indeed end with this one: change the world. Let's change the world, let's shift it, let's shake it and remake it. Let's rearrange the pieces, the patterns in the maze, the reason for our days, in ways that make it better, in shades that make it brighter, that make the burden lighter, because it's shared, because we dared to dream and then to sweat it, to make our mark and not regret it. Let's plant a seed and humbly say, I changed the world today. Let's change the world, let's lift it, let's take it and awake it. Let's challenge every leader, the citadels of power, the prisoners in the tower. The hour of need's upon us. It's time to raise our voices, to stand up for our choices, because it's right, because we fight for all that's just and fair, for a planet we can share. Let's join the cause and boldly say, we'll change the world today. Let's change the world, let's love it. Let's hold it and unfold it. Let's redesign the future, the fate of earth and sky, the existential why. Let's fly to where there's hope, to where the world is greener, where air and water's cleaner. Because it's smart to make a start, to fix what we have broken, our children's wish unspoken. Let's be the ones who rise and say, we changed the world today. Thank you very much.
Very beautiful. Thank you so much, Wayne. I really enjoyed the conversation and all the knowledge you shared with us. And yeah, all the best with your adventures and the book and podcast and all the good things you're doing.
You're most welcome. Put the link to the poem also in the chat, and thank you
that's
for
great.
being here. Thank you for hosting. Thank you for the conversation. I hope that I get back to South Africa sooner rather than later, and get to see some of you in person again.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm just going to close off with some last slides.
And I'll need to just run off. So thank you, everyone. And
thanks so
all
much.
The best.
Great.
Do connect on LinkedIn if you're into that kind of thing. Bye now.
Bye-bye. Hey, guys. So we have a couple last slides left. So I just want to talk to you about the upcoming events that we're having. So next month, we're going to do One Planet Living Framework. In August, we're going to do a session on biomimicry. In September, we're planning a session on alternative building materials. And if the originator of this idea is in the audience, please drop me your name. And similarly for October, we're planning a session on building modeling and simulation. So again, if the originator of the idea is in the audience, please let me know your name so we can reward you with your 500 Rand voucher that we promised you last month. So again, thank you so much for joining us. Again, if you want to join the Regenerative Collaborative, please drop us an email. We'd love to have you. So I'd like to thank very much Van Dyck for sponsoring this webinar. We cannot thank you enough for making it possible to offer CPD validation for these webinars to all the people attending. Thank you very much. Thank you to Wayne, our speaker. I think it was an amazing discussion and very insightful. And then lastly, thank you to our team, the people that are volunteering for the RCSA and making these events happening. Thank you very much. Really appreciate your input and efforts. And again, just a reminder, our previous events are available on our website. We're not that quick in uploading all of them as quickly as we want to. So if you have any experience in editing videos, that would help us a lot as well if you want to join us. So this is where you can find, there's still CPD points available for the video, so you can still get them. And I want to close off with that. And thank you for attending. Really appreciate it. And we'll see you next month. Thank you very much. Enjoy your evening.